Part ghost story and part cautionary tale, the legend of La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman, is one that lives in the hearts of many worldwide. Whether you identify as Hispanic, Latinx, Chicana or Chicano, or simply grew up in an area with a strong Mexican influence, her terrifying tale transcends cultural boundaries. The American Southwest, with its unique blend of cultures and large Mexican-American population, is no exception, and also embraces La Llorona as one of its own. On this episode, we explore everything about La Llorona, from her possible origins to her role in our modern-day folklore. We'll discuss her as a frightening warning for both children and grown men, with insights from local experts in folklore and the paranormal. I'm Adrian Mesa, and welcome to Weird Tales from El Paso. As a kid growing up in the 90s, my grandma's house was one of my favorite places to be. I would spend hours in her backyard playing games with my cousins while her chihuahuas yipped and yapped all around us, running and hiding behind the pomegranate trees and the pecan trees that were in full bloom. It was the kind of nostalgic experience you just don't really appreciate until you're much older. Life really did feel so much simpler back then, with nothing to worry about except what game to play next or who had their Pokemon cards with them. But eventually, the sun would start to get low in the sky. And right before going inside for the night, my attention would turn to the arroyo that ran alongside my grandma's backyard. Most times, I thought nothing of it and shrugged it off. But other times, a sense of unease crept over me. I'd go and peek over the stone fence separating the yard from the arroyo, and I could swear I just saw a ghostly figure vanish into the shadows, accompanied by the distant sound of crying. Of course, kids at that age have wild imaginations, especially kids like me who watch way too many horror movies at way too young an age. I, as of now anyway, have never had an encounter with La Llorona, but that doesn't stop my fascination with her from growing. Even today, I sometimes feel uneasy on dark, rainy days, thinking about the legend. But what is the story of La Llorona actually? Where and when did it start? Let's first look at the most common version of La Llorona's legend. This is the tragic tale of a devoted wife and mother, betrayed and abused by her husband, leading her to commit an unspeakable act of revenge by drowning her own children in a nearby river. Cursed to forever wander near rivers and other bodies of water for her heinous act, La Llorona's cries echo endlessly as she looks for her murdered children, draped in a long, white gown, and claiming the souls of other children unlucky enough to come within her reach. This version of the story is the most widely accepted and known, with many families and storytellers passing down variations of it through generations as part of their culture. While small details may vary from family to family, region to region, or author to author, the core story remains the same. It serves as a cautionary tale to frighten children into behaving or keeping them safe, similar to how El Cucuy, another boogeyman-type figure in Mexican folklore, is used, or the boogeyman himself and Bloody Mary in North American culture. But going back to the original question, where and when did the legend of La Llorona start?
La Llorona is a story that I think many of us who are Mexican Americans who live in borders areas like we do will have a version of La Llorona. Other cultures have the same version of the Weeping Woman, so it's not just the Mexican American community, but those of us who identify ourselves as Mexican Americans know it as La Llorona, the Weeping Woman.
This is Dr. Meredith Abarca, professor of food studies and literature at the University of Texas at El Paso, creator and host of El Paso Food Voices, and twice former president of the Texas Folklore Society.
When I was growing up in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, which is where I was born with Laredo, Texas, My introduction to La Llorona was, my mother always reminded us of La Llorona when we would go to this park called Viveros, right by the river. Okay, the contents that I remember of La Llorona is my mother telling us that story when we were going too close to the river, and in order to keep us not going too deep in, that's when the Llorona story came in terms of La Llorona would be going through the river or close to the river, looking for her own children that she drowned in the river. She might take us, thinking that we are her children or to replace her children. My mother, she also, obviously, she's the one who told me the story. She grew up with it too. But for her, La Llorona threw her children off of a cliff. Why a cliff? Well, there was no river where my mother grew up in Michoacan. Those kinds of details change to fit the reality of a particular area.
While the river and flowing white gown are undoubtedly the most recognized of La Llorona's attributes, her myth isn't restricted to a single form or appearance, or area for that matter. She's also associated with a much wider range of feminine ghosts, ghouls, and witches in Mexican and Mexican-American folklore. In another version of the story aimed at adult men, for example, she takes on a much more active but sinister role. La Llorona is said to appear to unfaithful husbands at bars and clubs, seducing them with her beauty, only to reveal a more devilish appearance right before exacting revenge upon them for their deceitful lifestyles. In these stories, La Llorona is often accompanied by the smell of sulfur and portrayed as a beautiful woman with hooves or chicken feet, a detail her victim does not notice until it's too late. Other variations also have her transform into an ugly old woman who mocks the unfaithful husband. Once this is revealed, the husband is either brutally murdered by La Llorona or manages to escape, seeking redemption as he and others flee for their lives from the now burning bar or club. You'd be surprised how many Mexican and Southwestern communities have stories fitting this template. I myself have heard two such tales from my father and Tio on two different occasions. So whether she appears as a weeping woman in white, a seductive temptress with hooves, a haggard crone living under bridges or graveyards, or even a figure in black on horseback with a skull head, all real and localized examples of how diverse her legend is, each unique manifestation comes with its own version of the tale. But as radically different as all these versions may seem at first glance, a second look reveals many shared themes: trauma, struggle, vengeance, as well as a shared origin and real-world history. So, time for a quick history recap. In 1519, the soon-to-be famous Spanish conquistador, Hernán Cortés, arrived in Mexico, a land that was then ruled by the Aztec Empire under Emperor Moctezuma II. Tensions quickly escalated between the Spanish and the indigenous populations, ultimately leading to war. With the assistance of other indigenous groups unhappy with Aztec rule, Cortés ultimately seized the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1521, heralding the fall of the Aztec Empire and the onset of Spanish dominion in Mexico. Very interesting stuff to be sure, but I bet you're wondering what this has to do with the legend of La Llorona.
Legends are part of folklore, right? They have some level of historical reality or historical concreteness or historical facts. In terms of La Llorona, there's another historical figure, which is La Malinche, or what he has become to mean, traitor. There are accounts who argue that essentially La Llorona has become the legend, so to speak, the folklore legend, based on the historical figure Malintzin, because her indigenous name was Malintzin, not Malinche. So the gist of the story, the historical account is that there was an indigenous woman who was actually given to Cortés as a gift. And the reason is because she had an incredible ability to pick up languages and knew a number of dialects, indigenous dialects, and was able to pick up languages. So she sort of kind of became, quote unquote, a translator. But remember, this is a gift that was given, an object. So Hernán Cortés was able to capitalize on that, so to speak. Okay. But going back to the story of Malinche, she had children with Hernán Cortés, and they have been symbolically described as the first mestizos. And I say symbolically because we have a historical record of this one relationship, because somebody wrote about it in Cortés. But I think you can imagine that there were a lot of soldiers, a lot of military people, a lot of Spanish that rape a lot of the women. They probably were there already a lot. But because we do have a historical record of the Crónicas of Hernán Cortés, so we have a name that we can pinpoint to, right? Malincin has been, those offsprings have been categorized as the birth of the first mestizo, the first Mexicano. In contemporary lingo in Mexico, to be called Malinchista is to be called a traitor. And the folklore of that, the reason where that comes from, is that Malinche basically betrayed her people by sleeping with the enemy and producing bastard children. So there have been some scholars who've said that the Llorona has become the legend representing this historical figure, Malincin, Marina Malinche. So that the legend comes out of something that actually historically existed. And that's where I think we draw the symbolisms. The children that she drowned or the children that she killed, it's not that she killed them literally drowned them or literally threw them over the cliff or whatever, but that the children that she gave birth to somehow are propelled to this death, to the symbolic death, because they are bastard children. And that's another way of reading it, that the children that were born out of this encounter, because I don't even want to call it union, have become lost children. And you can think the word lost to mean a lot of different things, right?
So while La Malincin story undoubtedly provides a concrete historical backdrop for La Llorona's legend, what if she predates Cortés and the Spaniards in Mexico altogether? What if long before their arrival in 1519, there were already tales of a crying female figure haunting Tenochtitlan streets?
La Llorona has a long history, even before, the Spanish conquistadores came to the Aztec, empire. So this was something happening way long before. So the question is, where are these stories coming from?
This is Ramiro Galvan, an independent paranormal investigator and founder of Paranormal Research Investigations, PRI, in El Paso, Texas. For years, Ramiro has devoted himself to researching the paranormal around the borderland.
I came across a book written by a friar, and it's called The General History of Things of New Spain by Friar Bernardito de Sahugin, the Florentine Codex. And on there, in one of the volumes, he actually wrote about a woman crying for her children as early as 1505 in Aztec culture.
In the years leading up to the arrival of the Spaniards, it is said that Moctezuma II received 8 omens foreshadowing the fall of the empire. The 6th omen, in particular, depicted a weeping woman walking the streets at night, crying out for her quote-unquote children to flee from some unknown danger. So could La Llorona have manifested as one of these 8 signs of doom, as recounted by the friar in his writings?
His ultimate goal was to see, understand if these people, if they could convert them to the natives to Christianity. But in doing so, he had to talk to them and find out about their beliefs. And the responses were recorded in their own pictorial form of writing. In other words, they didn't have writing like you and I would recognize. They used pictographs as a way to communicate. And they actually drew a picture of what they believed was a Llorona. The people heard a weeping woman night after night. She passed by in the middle of the night, wailing and crying out in a loud voice, "My children, we must flee far away from this city." And at other times she cried, "My children, where shall I take you?" And these were people who actually said they encountered her. So they're, relaying their experiences to this friar as he's documented in these codexes. And so over time, it's kind of spread out all over the Southwest. So the question is that, is this something that's particular to our culture? Probably. In all likelihood, I think it is.
But what exactly do these stories say about Mexican and Mexican-American culture? Well, let's look at the 2 possible origins. On one hand, you have the weeping woman wandering the streets of Tenochtitlan, crying and urging her children to flee long before the Spaniards even arrived in 1519. I mean, it's hard to ignore the similarities between these accounts and the eventual modern-day legend. On the other hand, there's the real-world history of La Malincin and her role as a translator and mistress to Cortez. While some view her as a traitor to her people, a more modern approach to her story is to see her as a survivor, or a mother to a new race. Either way, motherhood and women's roles in Mexican culture are themes that resonate strongly in both narratives, and in all the modern-day retellings for that matter. The diverse portrayals of these women, from the sorrowful weeping woman to the seductive devil or old hag, reveal pretty complex and unflattering perceptions of women's roles in Mexican culture.
Very first paper I ever published, in which I talk about these three Mexican archetypes: La Llorona, La Malinche, and La Virgen de Guadalupe. These are the three archetypes, three female archetypes given to Mexican women. And I find them all quite problematic. The Virgin is the one that we like the most, right? Because she's kind and loving and caring, and she's the mother, and she doesn't have sex, and she doesn't talk loud. And it's sort of this quiet, subdued, obedient image. Or you have the one who has a language and speaks and is considered the traitor. In the middle option, to say that the Llorona will be the middle, well, in the legends, and talk about folklore, all she does is wail. So it's like, these are three very problematic figures as archetypes. Go back to folklore. They have been changing quite a bit. Because there have been many people who are retelling the story of La Malinche, for instance, using her indigenous name, Malincin, and talking about that instead of that she had a vision for a new world, for a new race. So basically, something that historically happened, that in order for you and I to understand, it has to come through a story. How do we frame the story impacts how we understand both folklore, legends, but also history.
So, given the deep-rooted nature of the legend of La Llorona within Mexican and Mexican-American culture, how does she manifest in the Southwest, particularly in El Paso, Texas, with its unique position along the border?
La Llorona has been seen, here in El Paso in 1911, 1910, downtown Chihuahuita. People would often see her around there. That's where a lot of the, back then, that's where a lot of people lived. I received a audio recording back in 2015 from an anonymous source at the time. Well, I should say a confidential source. And he sent me about a minute and a half it was a transcript of a radio call from an Anthony police officer describing that he has seen a woman in white, appears to be covered in blood, carrying what appears to be a baby in her arms.
The following is a short segment from that audio. You can listen to the full clip over on the PRI YouTube channel. Please check the show notes for the link.
Ma'am, I'm looking at the location 123 Los Traques. Seems to be already in New Mexico. There's a female. Seems to be covered in blood, carrying a newborn, walking back and forth.
74, is New Mexico out with you?
Negative, ma'am. She's also... Stand by.
6772.
6772, I'm in a route. Ma'am, just for information, she's also wearing a long white dress. I'm not trying to make contact.
Yeah, 54.
There were some people who commented on that post, and there was a lady who posted on there because people were going, again, they were poo-pooing the idea that, it kind of sounds fake, they're not following protocol. And this one person responded, she goes, that was my call. She goes, I was the dispatcher on call that night, and it was all true. And she was retired by then. But she confirmed that this officer, in fact, did see something there, and that the guy, the responding police officer who saw this was so traumatized by the event, they called EMS out there because they thought he was having a heart attack. And it turned out that one of the EMS guys who responded that night was one, I knew that guy. And he confirmed that, he says, we showed up. The guy looked like he was in trauma. He was white. He was shaking. He was looking like he was going to go into shock. We had to check him for vitals. We were ready to, give him the paddles, for, restart his heart. He was having a heart attack. And then once they got him settled down, they went out looking where she had gone, because they were thinking, well, maybe this is an injured person, she got away, or, maybe she's drunk or under the influence of something. Couldn't find her. And we actually, in 2021, my team and I decided to go ahead and retrace the steps out there. And so we went out during the day and we interviewed local people that are in and around the neighborhood. And there were some people there who were like, no, I've never heard of her. But you could tell there was a wall put up right away. And then there was other people who were like, I've seen her. I've seen her in broad daylight walking along in this area. And they described her. So it just so happens that in that area, we decided to go in the same location where this police officer responded. We decided to go investigate and see what we could dig up. And we had some interesting encounters that night. There was one area that was like a little train trestle area that you could go under, and we actually caught what we call an EVP down there, which is defined as electronic voice phenomena, where we don't hear it, but our electrical recording instruments, whether it's camera or audio recorder, recorded a female voice responding to a question. Now there was only one female there, and it wasn't her. We also had weird things happen. Like I had a thermal camera where I was keeping an eye on some people, some of the team, and I had 2 batteries, long life batteries. They should have lasted at least an hour. Within 15 minutes, they were drained. Which is it's not uncommon when you're doing this kind of thing. 2 of my team members were walking along the railroad track, and you can see there's nobody around, just those 2, and they're both calling me back on the radio, telling me they're smelling perfume out of nowhere. Which was interesting. Because I didn't smell it. Because I went up to where they were at and I couldn't smell anything. And they're going, yeah, we smell it. It's perfume. We were talking to one of the local residents there who initially was a little bit on the defensive because he was walking around that area. But once I told him what we were doing, he opened up and he said that, he says, you can hear her. When she's out here. What do you mean? He goes, when she's out here, the dogs start howling. And sure enough, about 10 minutes later, you hear dogs start howling out there for no reason at all. And it's like, okay, well, maybe, again, we're looking for plausible reasons. Maybe it's a cat. Maybe, but dogs would be barking at a cat as opposed to howling.
Many authors, researchers, and creatives have taken liberties with the legend, adding and changing details to suit their specific narrative needs. My fascination with La Llorona began personally when author Joe Hayes visited my elementary school a long time ago and read us his take on the legend, an interpretation I highly recommend for introducing La Llorona to kids. Alongside these adaptations are also the countless stories of encounters and hauntings attributed to La Llorona by everyday people, such as those shared by Sam, an El Paso native who has had her fair share of spooky experiences and was nice enough to share some of those stories with us. Sam was unable to join us for this recording, so I'll be reading her story on her behalf. I used to live on the west side, off of Country Club, maybe 60 feet from the Rio Grande, the Montoya Country Club area. The small trailer park I lived in was secluded by trees and always took on an eerie quality at night. One night in particular, I went outside to smoke a cigarette at around 3 a.m. I was about halfway done when I heard what sounded like a woman's voice crying in the distance. My blood ran cold and I froze for a second, wondering if maybe the lack of sleep was making me hallucinate. But I heard it again. I put out my cigarette, ran back inside and locked the door. I never went outside past sunset again. Looking back on it now, I'm not sure if I told my husband. Otherwise, he might have heeded my experience when him and his brother decided to go walk by the Rio at night. It must have been past 9 p.m. as the kids were in bed, when him and my brother-in-law came running back home in a frenzy. They said they saw a white figure walking along the riverbed and immediately started running back. My mother-in-law, who lived down a dirt road in the same trailer park, felt that the area was very haunted. Her trailer was at the park's edge, and over the fence past her backyard was empty land with grass and bushes. She told us that at night they would go out onto their patio and see figures walking all the time and hear things in the middle of the night, like low screams and voices. Tino, who lives in a California border town, was also kind enough to share a particularly terrifying encounter he had with La Llorona while visiting family in Mexico.
It was the summer of 2008 and my family decided to take a trip to Mexico to visit relatives. I was about to join the Marine Corps and my mom wanted to see my family just in case something bad happened. At the time, I was with my pregnant girlfriend, who would later become my wife and then ex-wife. Since she was pregnant, I didn't want to leave her alone, so I brought her with me. She also didn't speak any Spanish, so I had to translate all the conversations for her. We all chatted and had a great time catching up with each other. One of my aunts, knowing I liked spooky stuff, suddenly brought up La Llorona, aka the Weeping Woman. My mom tried to get my aunt to stop since she knew that it would get me both interested and scared, but I encouraged her to continue. I mean, I was going to be a Marine after all, and I couldn't let a silly myth scare me. My aunt proceeded to tell us about how whenever she would sleep over at my grandma's house, the place we were currently at, and if she stayed up late enough, she would be able to hear her wails, the wails of La Llorona. Seeing how serious everyone had gotten at that moment, my girlfriend nudged me and asked what we were talking about. I told her the myth of the wailing woman, about how she drowned her children in the river and was destined to walk along the rivers of Mexico looking for her dead children. She of course laughed, not buying any of it. We had a good laugh and then started talking about other things, and La Llorona was forgotten. That night, my parents insisted that my girlfriend and I should stay at the old house where I had grown up, since we were both adults and needed our own space. It was being renovated at the time, so there were no bedroom doors or working lights. The only doors the house had were the ones that led outside, but they were your standard flimsy metal doors. Any good kick or punch would rattle them, but we made it work. We left the bedroom window above the bed open to keep us cool, used a candle and a flashlight to move around, and I even put up a bedsheet on the bedroom door for extra privacy. We also made friends with a friendly stray dog that liked to hang out outside the house. My girlfriend and I got settled and stayed up late talking about the day before, eventually falling asleep. Sometime much later, a noise woke me up. I don't know exactly what time it was because I didn't have a cell phone, and my cheap watch at the time was horrible at keeping time. Feeling cold, I tried to steal some of the covers back from my girlfriend and debated getting up to close the window when I heard a long, distorted female wail. I could hear the old raspiness in her voice, as if she had been yelling for such a long time that her throat was getting ready to give out. What also confused me was that the wail sounded as if it was being played through an old gramophone. I don't know if it was the scratchiness of her voice or what exactly, but it sounded like an old creepy record playing over and over. Then I heard the infamous words of, "Ay, mis hijos," or "Oh, my children," and I knew it was La Llorona. I was both excited and terrified at the same time. I remember feeling a cold chill traveling down my spine, reinforcing my fear. The wails grew louder, making it seem as she was slowly heading towards the house. My girlfriend started to stir and woke up. She smiled and asked what was going on. Later, she told me she thought my aunts were playing a joke on us. The wails grew even louder. There's a myth that if you hear the wails close, she's actually far away, but if you hear them in the distance, she's close to you. I just mentioned to my girlfriend to be quiet and to listen. She saw my face and heard my tone of voice and immediately knew that something was wrong. Another loud wail passed by, echoing inside the house. My girlfriend started shaking, terrified. I held her, and I could feel her tears running down her face onto my arm. Each time the wail came, it grew louder and closer until it sounded like she was right outside our window. Doing the only thing I could think of, I pulled the covers over us and tried to remain as still as we could. The wails eventually faded out, and just as we thought she had gone, we heard two dogs viciously start fighting and slamming against the front door. Then as suddenly as the fight started, it stopped. We tried to stay up for a while longer to see if we heard anything else, but eventually we just fell asleep again. The following morning we walked outside to see if we could find the stray dog, but he was gone. All that was left was stirred up dirt from the fight. We never saw that dog again for the rest of the trip, so we just told ourselves he found a place with better owners who could feed him more. To this day, whenever I pick up my daughter from my now ex-wife's house, I ask her about what happened in Mexico, but she doesn't like talking about it. I haven't been back to Mexico ever since.
So whether you're into ghost stories, curious about culture and traditions, or both, it's obvious La Llorona's got something for everyone. I hope this deep dive into La Llorona's background will encourage you to seek out some spooky books or movies, some of which I will link down in the show notes for added convenience, or even encourage you to reach out to someone and see what La Llorona means to them. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and until the next tale, keep it weird, El Paso. Weird Tales from El Paso is produced, written, and edited by me, Adrian Mesa, with original music by Aaron Mesa. I'd like to thank all the guests of the podcast for sharing their stories and expertise with us, and for their contribution to the folklore and culture of the borderland. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, review, and subscribe to stay up to date on new episodes. And if you'd like to share your own experience with us, please reach out at bluelabpro.com/WTF El Paso. Thanks.